Hi everyone, Stjepan here. In today's video I'm going to start a series on the Catalan opening, which is an opening for white you can play against anything. It doesn't matter what black does. It's not a completely system opening. There's a lot of theory involved as opposed to the London system, but you can play it against anything. You always put your pieces on the same squares and you always have very similar plans. That's what makes the opening extremely popular on all levels. But as opposed to, for example, again, the London system, it's also one of the most popular openings at the top level. For example, Dengliren uses the Catalan as one of his main openings for white. So, what is the Catalan? First of all, the opening got its name in 1929, sort of by force. Savili Tartakover played, he was one of the best players at the time, played a tournament in Barcelona in Catalonia, and they asked him to play a new opening that they could name against after Catalonia. So he played the Catalan and then they called it the Catalan. Okay, so today it's being played by many top players. So the Catalan starts after pawn to d4. That's a d4 opening, and from here you can play it against two main moves for black. If black plays c5 straight away, well then you are playing the old Benoni. You cannot really play the Catalan. But if black plays either d5 or knight f6, you can play a normal Catalan. You can also play it against e6 and g6. So the first thing I should say is that you can reach the Catalan via several different move orders. Okay, let's look at d5 and then let's look at knight f6. After d5, you go for the Catalan setup with the moves c4, g3, bishop g2, and knight f3. So what you are trying to achieve is a kingside fianchetto and a very powerful bishop on g2, and you try to undermine black's center straight away with the move c4, or if black plays knight f6 instead of d5, you claim the center with c4 first. So you can start after, for example, d5, you can start with the c4 straight away with the queen's gambit. That's the most common way. You could also start with knight f3. You could also in fact start with g3. Let's look at d5 first. So c4. And now let's say black plays the main move, which is the queen's gambit declined. You can continue with knight f3, and after knight f6 we reach the Catalan position after g3. So this is the most thematic starting position of the Catalan. Now let's reach it via a different move order. So for example, after d4, black plays knight f6, we continue in completely same fashion. So c4, black plays e6, preparing to either go into the queen's gambit declined after, for example, knight c3, or preparing to go into the Queen's Indian or the Nimzo Indian after, for example, knight c3, or after knight f3 preparing to go in for the Queen's Indian or for the Bogo Indian. But what we do here, we can choose between two different moves. We can start with knight f3 and after d5, g3 we are in the Catalan, or we can start with the move g3, avoiding all the hassle and making the Queen's Indian impossible, making the Bogo Indian impossible. We don't have a knight on f3, and also making the Nimzo Indian impossible. So this is the pure Catalan, avoiding all the main openings. And that's, I think, one of the main benefits of the Catalan. If you play this move order with g3 first, you simply avoid all the stuff that black can do. The Queen's Indian, the Nimzo Indian, the Ragozin setup, the Vienna, or anything. Okay, so that's the Catalan. You can also reach it with one knight f3, doesn't really matter. For example, d5, d4, let's say knight f6, and you can reach it via several different move orders. So, the main branching of the position is whether black accepts your pawn or not. If you have any prior experience with the Catalan, or if you've seen the Catalan in practice, then you will know that after, for example, d4, knight f6, c4, e6, g3, d5, bishop to g2, excuse me, or knight f3. Black has the option of taking this pawn, or he also has the option of not taking the pawn. So we are going to be calling this open and closed Catalan, as theory states. When black takes our gambited pawn, that's the open Catalan. When black simply goes for development with bishop to e7, that's the closed Catalan. And closed Catalan is going to be covered in a separate video. I'm going to be covering well, 12 different variations. It's going to be a very long series. The closed Catalan is going to be one of them because it's way simpler than taking the pawn, and there's far less theory. And when it comes to the open Catalan, we're going to be looking at 9 different variations, so prepare for a long series. The point is, after black takes the pawn, a few things have happened on the board. The first thing is our Catalan bishop, and we are going to be calling this the Catalan bishop, is now a monster. This bishop is now the strongest minor piece on the board. It's cutting across black's queenside, and it's very hard to counter that bishop. Why? Because black cannot simply play b6, bishop b7, we would take the rook. The second thing is, well, black is up a pawn. He just captured our pawn on c4. What does that mean? Well, for the moment he has the pawn, which in some variations he will keep, in some variations he will give back, and all of that will be discussed in great detail in the 9 separate videos on the open Catalan. But a few things we can say theoretically immediately. Black has doubled pawns. In theory, these are much weaker, both of them, than all the other pawns on the board. Well, the c4 pawn is visually, immediately, it's quite simple to see that it's weak. White could attack it with queen a4 check immediately. White could also attack it with knight f3, knight e5, and this pawn seems like it's about to drop unless something extreme happens. But also, the c7 pawn is weaker than it used to be, because now there's no white pawn on c4, and the move such as queen c2 is actually putting pressure on c7 as well. If rook c1 happens, which is quite common, then the c7 pawn could be in trouble. Okay, the third point, if white regains this pawn at any point, so for example, queen a4 is also a line we are going to be looking at in a separate video. So for example, this happens, just to give you an example. What happens when white regains his pawn on c4 is that black has traded his d7 pawn for white's c2 pawn. That means that white has an extra pawn in the center of the board. You can see that black only has a pawn on e6. White has pawns on d4 and e2. So if white manages to regain the pawn, then he has greater central control. Okay, however, after d takes c4, there are a couple of more things going on. Well, the first thing is, the Catalan is not an aggressive opening in which you go for black's king and in which you try to checkmate black straight away. Instead of that, what you do is you exert huge pressure on the queen side and on the center and try to gain as much control and as much space as you can during the opening. For that, you have given black the opportunity to take material. He took your pawn, and in exchange for that you are gaining time and initiative. What also happens in all d4, d5 positions is that if d takes c4 happens, it's much easier to play the move e4. And in an ideal world, what the Catalan player wants is to get back this pawn and also expand with e4, meaning that you have a broad center. So for example, let's play random moves, stupid moves for black. G6 is the dreadful move. Let's say knight f3, let's say g6, let's say queen c2. Now queen c2 is a very common move in the Catalan because it both puts pressure on c4 and prepares e4. You can see that this knight is defending. So for example, e4. And now you can see that unless black does something to defend this pawn, white is both going to regain his pawn and have huge central control with an extra central pawn. Okay, let's talk about theory just briefly. I'm just going to show you the main variations we could get into, and I'm going to show you why the Catalan is very popular at top level, and then we are going to talk about some more ideas. So in this position, now we have reached it via d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, g3, dc4, same position, bishop g2. Black has a lot of options. I'm just going to show you two things before we get into the main open Catalan stuff. The reason why most people play knight f3 is because white is considered to be okay in the main lines of the Queen's Indian and in the main lines of the Bogo Indian. So for example, b6 or bishop b4. However, by playing g3 first, you simply avoid that. So it's your choice. You can either allow the Queen's Indian and the Bogo Indian, or you can avoid it with g3. I prefer to avoid. all that stuff and just go in for the straight Catalan. Okay, coming back to this position, one option that's also going to be covered in a separate video is this move queen a4, which we talked about briefly already, which avoids all the theory I'm about to show you in 9 videos and just regains the pawn straight away. Queen a4 check, knight bd7 is the most popular move. And now with queen c4, black is already slightly better. White has simply wasted a ton of time to get this pawn back, and this is not in Catalan spirit. It has been played and it is being played on the highest levels, and if you don't know what you're doing, it's the simplest option to just regain your material, and we are going to cover it in a separate video, but it's not the most critical. The most critical is to play the move bishop g2, or if you already played bishop g2, then to play knight f3. Doesn't matter, they can transpose. And now have a look at this. Black has 9 viable options, some of them better, some of them worse, some of them tricky for white to face, some of them less tricky. Nevertheless, all 9 have to be known to great extent by white, because if black plays one of them and you don't know them, you can lose in a matter of moves. Remember that you have given up material. If black is given enough time to consolidate his extra pawn and to develop his pieces, then you will have a dream scenario from the semi-Slav defense, where white is just pushing, where black is just pushing his pawn majority forward. Let me just show you that briefly, and I'll actually flip the board here so that I can show you that. And this I've had in several games. So d4, d5. I'm showing you a position from the semi-Slav just to give you an example. Okay, so here and here and here, and we have the main line Meran, and let's say bishop b3, and let's say a6. In this position, white simply has to play e4 to fight for central control straight away. If he doesn't do that, then black is already equal or slightly better. A very common mistake is for people to castle here. And once black gets in c5, he already has huge pressure on the queen side. Now, let's have a look at, for example, queen e2, which has been played against me. And after bishop b7, let's say, for example, rook to d1. Now here, you can see that there's the option to simply expand at some point and have this 3-2 pawn majority rolling forward, which is very hard to stop. Also, black's bishop is a very good piece. So coming back to the position we discussed, if black is allowed to do something similar to consolidate this 3-2 pawn majority, never mind the pawn on c7, it's fairly similar to the pawn thrust in the semi-Slav. So white has to be extremely careful against wall moves. So what can black do? The main line is pawn to a6, and the idea behind pawn to a6, let me just make this the main line. The idea behind pawn to a6 is to simply try to defend your pawn. So when white castles, which is the main move, black can play b5 straight away, defending the pawn, or he could play knight c6, which is the main move. But you can see that this pawn chain is now consolidated. So what does white do against that? Now we are coming to one of white's, well, to 2 of white's main plans in the early stages of a Catalan. One of them is knight e5, unleashing this bishop on the rook along the long diagonal. And the second one is, if black tries to consolidate his pawns, you simply break through that structure, if need be, giving up the pawn for good with a4 and or b3. Just breaking open that structure, creating several weaknesses. So in this case, you play knight e5, the rook is attacked. A common way for black to fight against that is to block the position with knight to d5. Now this bishop is blunted, and now you continue, you play a4. And in this position, if black is not careful, for example, if he takes, then black is already simply lost. You take here, and after here, for example, this. The a6 pawn is weak, the c6 square is weak, black is far away from castling, and it's simply lost. So after something like a4, black simply has to accept the fact that you're breaking his structure open. And now, of course, not taking, because the rook is now defended, but b3. And in this position, actually, this is a theoretical position which ends up with black giving a piece, and there's nothing better he could do. Or he can take on b3 straight away, and after ab5, rook a8, bishop a8, queen b3, you can see that black's development and the fact that all of these targets exist make white's position very simple to play. So that's very common. Knight e5, weakening the diagonal, and then a4, b3, undermining the pawn structure when black tries to consolidate. Other than a6, which we are going to be looking at in great depth, which is the main line, black can play knight c6, black can play c5, black can play bishop b4 check, black can play bishop to d7, black can play bishop e7, black can play b5, what else? Black can play c6, and black can play knight b to d7. All of these are theoretical moves. If you are a masochist and you want to know the Catalan perfectly, Grandmaster Repertoire 1d4 by Boris Avruk, in volume 1, 200 pages are devoted to these 9 variations. So again, knight c6, the second most popular move, then c5, bishop b4 check, bishop to d7, etc. I'm going to make a separate video on each of these moves. So the whole Catalan series is going to be 12 videos, not counting the introductory video, where we are going to be looking at queen a4 check lines, avoiding the theory in the open Catalan, 9 videos going over all of these key moves, 1 video going over the closed Catalan, and 1 video going over bishop b4 check lines for black, which I'm going to show you in a second. Just one thing before we do that. So let's have a look at the closed Catalan briefly. So after d5, bishop g2. If black doesn't take, then his second option is to play bishop e7. And bishop e7 is not the critical way to play, but it's definitely more solid. Black is just going to A, develop the king side, B, develop the queen side, and doesn't care about your pawn. You can do whatever you want. So for example, knight f3, black castles, you castle. Now at this point, it's not quite the same because black has already castled. So here, black could play c6, black could play knight bd7, or he could take the pawn, but it's still the closed Catalan now. This we are going to be covering in a separate video. Now, coming back to the original position, one more thing I would like to show you. There are 2 more options for black. So far, we've only been looking at d5, sort of complying to white's plans of going into the Catalan after the move g3. Black has 2 more options. One of them is what I think most Catalan players hate seeing on the board, and that's the move c5. And after the move c5, you are basically forced to either transpose into the fianchetto Benoni or into a variation of the English. If you play d5, this is now the fianchetto Benoni, and you can watch the Benoni playlist for this. So ed5 and cd5 and d6 and knight c3, normal fianchetto Benoni. This is not bad for white, it's great for white in my opinion, but there's a ton of theory, separate theory. Or after c5, you can play knight f3 and going into a sort of either, well, going into an English after cd4, knight d4, d5, bishop g2, Reti/English. And the other option after g3, if black doesn't want to go into the main lines, he could play in a sort of Bogo Indian fashion. It's just that the knight is not on f3, there's a pawn on g3. And this move refuses to go into the main lines. And here bishop to d2. There are 2 main moves, queen e7 and bishop e7, both highly theoretical. We are going to be covering all of this in a separate video as well. This I would recommend for players with black who just don't want to learn how to fight the Catalan. This is the simplest way to play. Just play bishop b4 check, avoid all the main lines, and it's quite simple. That being said, the main benefit of this after, for example, bishop to e7 and bishop to g2 and d5 is that black has misplaced white's bishop, which doesn't really want to be on d2. Generally, it wants to be on b2. So yeah, we are going to be talking about all of that in the next 12 videos. I hope you liked the introductory video, and as I said, we are going to be going into great detail. This series will last for about 2 weeks. I'm going to say maybe 3 weeks. And hopefully at the end of it, you know the Catalan really well. Let me know what you think. See you tomorrow and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.